as I mentioned, there are around more than 2,000 applicants to attend this event, but we can only accommodate around 400. So many. And be simplistic and just a few questions. How about that? Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you. That's extraordinary. My name is Vasilis Trigas, a visiting assistant professor at the Schwarzman College here in Tsinghua University. My question goes to John. You know, you always descend head on with the establishment, with the deep state, with the blob. And so, do you feel safe lately to be so, arguing so heavily against the establishment? Would you ever consider political asylum application in China? And more specifically, why do you think that the US has not been disciplined by the rise of China? So in the structural theory, the rise of China should have disciplined US overextension and entanglement in the Middle East and in Europe. So why hasn't this happened? Do you have any prediction about when is it going to happen?
I have challenged the establishment on many issues, for sure, but I don't have to think about political asylum at this point, and hopefully I won't, but one never knows, given how crazy domestic politics is in the United States these days. Second question, and the more substantive one, a very important one. My argument, as you know, is that the most serious threat the United States faces is the rise of China and the need to contain China. And at the same time, the United States is pinned down in a war in Ukraine, and it's pinned down in these conflicts in the Middle East. And this overextension, to use your rhetoric, works to the detriment of containing China. It's very important to understand that it's difficult for the United States to fully pivot to Asia and to deal with China, in large part because of this overextension, because we're pinned down in these two sets of wars. To take it a step further, if you're in a multipolar system, and I do believe we're in a multipolar system, although there's not much difference between the two of us on the distribution of power in the system, but if you live in a multipolar system and Russia is the third great power, if you're the United States of America, you want the Russians as your ally, not as China's ally. But as a result of our foolish policies in Ukraine, we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. This makes no sense at all. So you raised the question, why do we do this, and what's the prospect of putting an end to this? I'll say very quickly what I think the answers are, but I can't go into detail because of time. First of all, the reason that we're so deeply involved in the Middle East and we can't put an end to those conflicts, and they are not ending anytime soon, is because of the Israel lobby. There you go. We have a deep-seated interest in having stability in the Middle East, so we can pivot. And we do not have stability, and this situation is getting worse by the day, as I don't have to tell you. And we can't do very much at all to influence Israel. Why is that? The lobby. With regard to Ukraine, we made the foolish decision in 2008, when Russia was very weak, to think that we could have another extension of NATO to include Ukraine. And we thought, as I said in my formal comments, we could shove NATO expansion down the Russians' throat. And we just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And it all blew up on February 24th, 2022, and we're now involved in this war. And it's hard to see how the war ends, and I would argue, I don't have the time to elaborate, that when that war ends, we are going to have poisonous relations for as far as the eye can see between the United States, the West, and Ukraine on one side, and Russia on the other side. We're going to be deeply involved in Europe for the foreseeable future, as well as the Middle East. And for the Chinese in the audience, all I would say is, this is good news for you, but it's bad news for the United States.
Okay, second one about a lady here. Yeah.
And thank you so much for the wonderful debate. And I have a question for John. And I'm a PhD graduate from School of Social Science here. I did economic study. So I'm currently studying the energy section. So I have a very specific question for you. So like regarding the war in Russia, and do you think there's a likelihood that it's going to resolve soon, say like next year? And if the war is going to resolve, do you think, or if not, is there a possibility or likelihood for EU and Russia to establish a pre-war trading relation, in particular in the energy section? And what does this mean for the balance of power globally? And thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. I think that the Russians are going to win the war. And the reason is very simple. This is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, what really matters is the balance of artillery on one side and the balance of manpower on, well, the balance of artillery between the two sides and the balance of manpower between the two sides. Because you have two armies that are standing toe-to-toe trying to bleed each other white. That's what a war of attrition is all about. And artillery is the main killer on the battlefield. The Ukrainians argue that over 80% of the casualties in the war are the result of artillery. In these kinds of wars, wars of attrition, it's infantrymen who do the dying and it's artillery that does the killing. Well, in terms of the balance of artillery, the Russians at different points have had either a 5-to-1 advantage, a 7-to-1 advantage, or a 10-to-1 advantage in artillery. When you have that kind of advantage and artillery is doing that much of the killing, you know who's in the driver's seat. Furthermore, when you look at the balance of forces on both sides, let's look at the balance of the populations on both sides. There are 5 times as many Russians as there are Ukrainians. Then to take it one step further, let's talk about air power. We talked about firepower on the ground, artillery. Let's talk about air power. In the early year of the war, the early months of the war, first year of the war, the Russians and the Ukrainians could not use air power to affect events on the battlefield. And the Russians couldn't do much because Ukraine had a lot of ground-based air defenses. Those ground-based air defenses have been largely eliminated, and the Russians are now free to roam around in the skies, point one. Point two is the Russians have thousands upon thousands of dumb bombs. Dumb bombs are bombs that have great difficulty hitting the target with precision. Well, the Russians figured out how to develop guidance kits that they can tack on, put on to these dumb bombs and turn them into smart bombs so that they are highly accurate. The Russians now have thousands upon thousands of smart bombs. They're free to roam around in the skies above the battlefield and do enormous damage to the Ukrainians on the ground. This is why now, today, the Ukrainians are on their back foot, right, and they're in terrible shape, and the Russians are winning in eastern Ukraine. The Russians are going to win the war. Now, to get to the heart of your question, the Russians are going to win an ugly victory. They're not going to conquer all of Ukraine. That is not in the cards. What they're going to do is conquer, I would say, between 20 and 40%. Hard to tell how much they'll grab. They'll take about 20 to 40% of eastern Ukraine, incorporate it into Russia. They've already annexed 4 oblasts plus Crimea. And they will also go to great lengths to make sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rump state, okay? But you're not going to get a peace agreement between the Russians on one side, the Ukrainians, and the West on the other side. No peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. It looks like the situation on the 38th parallel between North and South Korea. And this frozen conflict is going to take place in a poisonous environment where the Russians and the West and the Russians and the Ukrainians are doing everything to undermine each other's position. And to take it a step further, you have a number of flashpoints in that area that could turn that frozen conflict into a hot conflict. You have the Black Sea, you have Moldova, you have Belarus, you have Kaliningrad, you have the Baltic Sea, and now you have the Arctic. And conflict could break out in any one of those places. All of this is to say the present situation between Russia and the West and Ukraine and Russia is not likely to improve for a long, long time.